What if the most dangerous thing about your favorite Bible verse is not that you do not believe it, but that you have never once taken it literally? Psalm 16:11. David writes one line at the end of a prayer, and that line makes a claim so aggressive that if you actually heard what the Hebrew is doing, it would rearrange the way you spend a Tuesday. Let me take you into this. Psalm 16 is not a hymn David composed on a good day. The poem opens with a man saying, "Preserve me." That is the first word out of his mouth. Preserve me. This is a man under threat. Scholars flag the superscription. It is labelled a miktam, and there are only 6 psalms that carry that label. Every one of them comes from a context of danger, pursuit, something pressing down on the chest. So David is not philosophizing about happiness in a quiet room. He is staring at the possibility that his life ends, and the entire psalm is an argument. Premise, evidence, conclusion, that builds to one final line. Verse 11. That is where the argument lands. And the argument matters, because the line does not work without it. He says, "You make known to me the path of life. In your presence is the fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures for evermore." That is the English. The Hebrew is doing something the English cannot carry. The sentence pivots on a word most translations render as fullness. The Hebrew is sova, and sova is not a spiritual word. It is a famine word. It is the word you use when you have eaten until your body physically cannot take another bite. Deuteronomy uses it for the moment after a full meal. You shall eat and be sava. It is repletion, saturation, the point at which there is no remaining capacity for more. David takes that word, a word his listeners would have felt in their stomachs, in a culture where the next drought was never far off, and he applies it to joy. Not God gives a lot of joy. Not God gives the best joy. Sova. The vessel is full. There is no room left. The sentence structure in the Hebrew does something the English has to flatten. The phrase sova smachot et panika, saturation of joys, your face, compresses God's face and the saturation of joy into such tight proximity that they almost become the same thing. English needs a preposition to sort it out. In your presence is fullness of joy. But the Hebrew is closer to an equation. The face of God is the saturation of joy, not produces it, not leads to it, is it. And then the line keeps going. At your right hand, nimet, pleasures, netsack, forevermore. Nimet is the plural of a word that means sensory delight, aesthetic, experienced, felt pleasures. Not a concept you affirm, but a reality you taste. And the plural matters. David does not say there is one pleasure at God's right hand. He says pleasures, a variety, a multiplicity. This is not monotone bliss. It is the claim that the most diverse, textured delight in existence sits at the right hand of God. And netsack, forevermore, does not just mean a long time. The word carries a nuance of permanence that our forever misses. Not just duration stretching out, but a state that cannot be altered, cannot diminish, cannot habituate. That last part is where the whole verse cuts, because every pleasure you have ever experienced follows the same curve. The first sip of that drink is better than the fourth. The new house stops feeling new. The promotion stops feeling like a promotion. The dopamine hit habituates. This is not pessimism. It is the universal human experience that all pleasures decay. The stimulus wears down. You need more to feel the same thing. David puts Netzach next to Nemot and makes a claim that violates everything you have observed about the way pleasure works. These pleasures do not decay. They do not require escalation. They remain at full intensity, permanently. Now, the piece that makes this land differently than a sermon is the world David was speaking into. David's audience did not live in a secular vacuum. They lived in a polytheistic marketplace. Every deity in the ancient Near East offered its own pleasure portfolio. Baal offered rain and agricultural success. Your crops grow, your family eats. Asherah offered fertility and sexual vitality. Molech offered military protection. The Canaanite religious system was, functionally, a diversified investment strategy. Different gods for different needs. You hedged your bets. And this was not abstract. Judges and kings document that Israel kept getting pulled into exactly this, supplementing Yahweh with Canaanite practices, because why would not you? If Baal handles the rain department and Yahweh handles the covenant department, a prudent person covers both. David's claim in verse 11 is a direct assault on that entire economy. He does not say Yahweh offers better pleasures than the competition. He says sova, saturation, full, no remaining capacity. If joy is at maximum in God's presence, there is no room for a competitor to add anything. Not because the competitors are forbidden, but because they are structurally unnecessary. The vessel is already full. That is not a devotional sentiment. In its original context, it is an economic polemic. David is standing in a marketplace of gods and declaring that one vendor has cornered the entire supply. Every other booth is selling something already included, at higher concentration, in what Yahweh provides. And notice what word David chose for the climax. Not duty, not obedience, not sacrifice, pleasures. The most God-devoted man in Israel's story ends his most God-centered prayer with a sensory word. The location of maximum pleasure in the universe, according to this poet, is not a beach, a bedroom, or a bank balance. It is the right hand of God. There is also a verb doing quiet, critical work at the start of the verse that almost no one talks about. Todayeni. You make known to me. It is a hipfil imperfect. Hipfil means causative. God causes David to know. David cannot find this path on his own. And the imperfect aspect means this causing to know is not a past event. It is ongoing, continuous. God is not handing David a map and walking away. This is more like a voice in real time, disclosing the next turn as David walks. Which means the path of life is not a principle you learn once and then apply. It is a relationship you stay inside of, where the next step is revealed as you take the current one. This passage is not about what it has been turned into. It has been turned into a promise about heaven. Someday, later, after you die, joy. That reading drains the present tense out of a psalm that is written in the present tense. David's heart is glad now. His flesh dwells secure now. God is counseling him now, at night, while the threat still presses. The eschatological dimension is real. Peter takes the psalm there in Acts 2, but David's primary claim is about the architecture of joy itself, where it lives, what it is made of, and it lives at God's face, which David has access to, today. In worship, in prayer, in the tabernacle. It has also been turned into a self-help verse. God has a path to your best life. But the path of Hayim terminates at Panika. Your face, God. Not my fulfillment. Not my career arc. Not my self-actualization. The destination of the path is a person, not a state. You do not pursue joy and stumble into God along the way. You pursue God's face, and joy is already there when you arrive. Someone I watched for about 3 years kept a running list on her phone, things she was looking forward to. Trips, meals, purchases, milestones. She updated it constantly, and every single item on that list, once it happened, produced about 72 hours of satisfaction before the list needed a new entry. The trip ended. The meal was digested. The purchase became normal. The milestone became the new baseline. She told me once, sitting on a bench outside a coffee shop, that she felt like she was feeding a furnace that burned everything she threw into it and never got warm. That furnace is what David is writing about, not the furnace, the alternative to the furnace. Sova. The claim that there exists a satisfaction so total that the furnace goes quiet, not because you stopped wanting warmth, because the room is finally warm. She was not doing anything wrong. The trips were good. The meals were good. The purchases were reasonable. The problem was not the wood. The problem was that she was building a fire in a fireplace that has no flue. Everything burns and nothing stays. David says there is a different fireplace, one where the heat holds. Or think about the moment after something actually good happens. A wedding, a birth, a breakthrough at work, and you are lying in bed that night, and there is this flicker, this tiny downdraft of sadness you cannot explain. The thing happened. It was real. It was good. And already, lying in the dark, some part of you knows it is receding. The peak has passed. The decay curve has begun. Most people interpret that flicker as evidence that joy is fragile, or that they are broken, or that nothing lasts, and they should stop expecting it to. David interprets it differently. That flicker, that tiny grief after the good thing, is a compass needle. It is not telling you joy is an illusion. It is telling you this particular joy was sourced from a location that has an expiration date. And the fact that you notice the expiration, the fact that something in you insists pleasure should be permanent, is not naivety. It is a homing signal. You were built for Netzach, permanent pleasures, and the fading of every temporary one is the signal that the permanent version exists somewhere you have not fully arrived yet. The psalm does not tell you to stop wanting. It tells you to want in the right direction. And this is what makes the psalm's ethics so strange. It is not asceticism. David is not renouncing pleasure. He is the most aggressively hedonistic voice in the entire Psalter. He ends with pleasures, plural, permanent, sensory. What he renounces are the inferior versions, verses 2 through 4. I have no good apart from you, the refusal to pour out drink offerings to other gods. That is not self-denial. That is a man who found the better product and stopped buying the knockoff. He is not less interested in pleasure than the Baal worshipper next door. He is more interested. He just knows where the real supply is. Which means the question the psalm puts on the table is not, are you willing to give up pleasure for God? The question is closer to, what if God's presence is not the cost of pleasure but the source of it, and everything else is the cost? There is a tension here I do not want to smooth over, because David says sova, saturation, and most honest people, including people who love God, would say they have not experienced that. They have experienced moments, flashes, a line in a hymn that cracked something open, a prayer that felt like it landed somewhere real. But saturation? Full? The famine word that means the hunger is gone? And the psalm does not flinch from that. It actually builds an explanation into its own structure. Look at the sequence. Verses 2 through 4 come before verse 11. The rejection of competing sources comes before the fullness arrives. David did not hedge. He went all in on one inheritance, God as his portion, his cup, his lot. And the fullness showed up on the other side of that exclusivity, which raises the uncomfortable diagnostic. If the saturation has not come, the psalm asks you to check not whether the promise is real, but whether the exclusivity is. Where are you still diversifying? What backup system are you maintaining? Not because it is evil, but because you are not yet convinced that God's face is enough. The path of life terminates at a face, and the face is not grim. What if you have already been on the path, and the only thing left is to stop looking past the destination? What are you hedging?